9 bodies scattered across a desolate, snow-swept mountainside. Some are found shoeless, dressed only in their sleeping clothes, their faces frozen in a mask of silent terror. Others are discovered weeks later, buried under 15 feet of snow in a ravine, their ribs crushed, their skulls fractured, yet their skin shows no sign of a struggle, no external wound. One is missing her tongue. Their clothing, when tested, will show traces of radiation. This is not the scene of a simple accident. It is a tableau of utter, incomprehensible horror. From the Archive of Folly, I am your chief archivist. We are a species that believes in cause and effect and rational explanations for terrible events. But some stories leave us stranded in the snow with a map whose compass spins wildly, pointing to a truth we may never be able to comprehend. We invite you to listen, and if you find meaning in these echoes of the past, we hope you will subscribe and help us preserve them. Our story begins with the vibrant, confident pulse of youth in the winter of 1959. It is the height of the Cold War, and the Soviet Union, having launched Sputnik into the heavens, is a nation brimming with a belief in scientific progress and the indomitable will of humanity. This spirit is perfectly embodied by a group of 10 students and graduates from the Ural Polytechnical Institute, 8 men and 2 women, all of them young, athletic, and bound by a shared passion for the wilderness. They are all what the Russians call master of sport, experienced hikers and skiers, tough and resourceful, the very picture of Soviet strength. Their leader is Igor Dyatlov, a 23-year-old engineering student, respected for his methodical planning and quiet confidence. Their goal is ambitious, a Level 3 certification, the highest and most difficult in the Soviet system. They plan to ski and hike nearly 200 miles across the unforgiving northern Urals, culminating in an ascent of a mountain named Otorten. It is a journey for the young and the brave, a test of will against the raw power of nature. They carried with them the tools of their time: heavy canvas tents, wool clothing, skis made of wood, and simple, hardy provisions. They also carried journals and cameras, instruments to record their conquest, to capture the stark beauty of the landscape and the easy camaraderie of their adventure. In one of those journals, in the final days, a clear, steady hand will write a simple, practical assessment of the challenge ahead. From this point on, the trail is difficult. We must ascend 300 meters. The slope is about 30 to 35 degrees. I'm not sure we can do it in the remaining daylight. It is the voice of a competent outdoorsman weighing risk and reward, the last recorded moment of normalcy before their world, and all logic is torn apart. The land they chose to conquer has another story, an older one, known to the indigenous Mansi people who have herded their reindeer here for centuries. The mountains have names, and the names have meaning. The peak the hikers aim to summit, Otorten, means "don't go there" in the Mansi language. And the specific slope where they will pitch their final tent, a shoulder of a mountain known on Soviet maps as Height 1079, has a different name in the Mansi tongue. They call it Kholat Syakhl, the Mountain of the Dead. According to their folklore, it is a place where 9 of their hunters once vanished without a trace, a place guarded by spirits who do not suffer trespassers. The expedition begins with cheerful optimism. The photographs from the early part of the journey show smiling faces, rosy-cheeked against the cold. They travel by train, then truck, then finally they ski off into the vast, silent wilderness. One member, Yuri Yudin, the 10th hiker, is forced to turn back early due to illness, a twist of fate that will save his life and condemn him to a lifetime of survivor's guilt. The remaining 9 press on. Their diaries and photographs paint a picture of a typical, arduous trek. They document the kilometers traveled, the quality of the snow, the biting winds. They write of singing songs around their small stove at night, of playful arguments and shared dreams. They are a team, a small, self-reliant society moving through an immense, empty world. One of their cameras, a a simple, durable Zorki, acts as the group's impartial eye. It captures the vast, rolling landscapes of white, the impossibly blue skies, and the tiny figures of the hikers moving across the snow. Their dark forms a stark contrast to the purity of their surroundings. This camera, which will later be found clutched in the hand of a dead man, is a silent witness, a historical object that holds the final baffling piece of evidence from their last night on Earth. As they move deeper into the mountains, further from any settlement, the tone of the diaries subtly shifts. The entries are still practical, but they speak more of the overwhelming power of the landscape. They encounter fierce winds, which they call buran, that force them to a crawl. They are tested, but they are not deterred. Their plan is to cross a pass and make camp on the far side, in the relative shelter of the forest. But on February 1st, something goes wrong. A snowstorm descends. Visibility drops to near zero, and they drift off course, moving west, toward the exposed slope of Kholat Syakhl. It is here, in this place the Mansi avoid, that they make their final camp. It is a strange decision for such an experienced group. The spot offers no natural protection from the elements. It is a bare, open slope, exposed to any wind that might sweep down from the summit. Yet, this is where they pitch their tent. The diary entry confirms their awareness of the difficult conditions. I'm not sure we can do it in the remaining daylight. They were tired. Perhaps they decided that a poor campsite was better than pushing on into the darkness. In the photographs recovered from their cameras, we see them digging into the deep snow, preparing the platform for their tent. Their faces are determined. They are working together, a well-oiled machine, unaware that they are setting the stage for their own destruction. Inside the tent, the 9 hikers create a small pocket of warmth and life in a universe of frozen indifference. They eat their dinner, a simple meal of bacon and bread. To lift their spirits, they produce a satirical newspaper they have been writing for the journey, the Evening Otorten, filled with in-jokes and humorous articles about their own expedition. It is a moment of profound and poignant normalcy. They are young, strong, and together, huddled within the thin canvas walls that separate them from the crushing, inhuman cold of the mountain night. They settle into their sleeping bags, the wind a distant howl, the hardships of the day fading into the promise of a restful sleep. And then something changed. We cannot know for certain what happened next. We have no testimony, no survivor. We have only the silent, screaming evidence they left behind. Something in the dead of that night drove 9 experienced, rational people to a state of pure, primal terror. It was a fear so absolute that it made them override their most basic survival instincts. It was not an avalanche. The tent was not crushed, and a later investigation would show no signs of a snowslide. It was something else. Perhaps it began with a sound or a vibration, a low subsonic frequency that vibrated not in the air, but in their bones, a pressure on the ears that feels like madness taking root. Or perhaps it was a light, a sudden, blinding brilliance that seared through the canvas of their tent. Whatever it was, it triggered an explosion of panic. They did not even take the few seconds required to untie the entrance of the tent. Instead, they took out their knives and sliced their way out, cutting through the thick canvas from the inside. They spilled out onto the open slope, into the teeth of a blizzard, into a temperature of 30 degrees below 0 Celsius. Some were barefoot. Others had only a single sock. None were properly dressed for the Arctic conditions. They fled, stumbling and scrambling down the steep, dark slope, away from the tent, away from their supplies, their coats, their boots, their only chance of survival. They ran from something they perceived to be a greater threat than freezing to death. When the group failed to send a telegram by their scheduled return date of February 12th, their families began to worry. A search party, composed of volunteer students and teachers, was assembled. On February 26th, they finally spotted it, the collapsed, half-buried tent on the slope of Kholat Syakhl. The scene they discovered was baffling. The tent was clearly cut open from within. All of the group's belongings, their boots, their warm clothing, their axes, their food, were still inside, neatly arranged. It was an abandoned ship. Its crew vanished into thin air. From the tent, a single line of footprints led down the slope. The prints were jumbled, suggesting a group moving together, some barefoot, some in socks, some in a single felt slipper. The tracks continued for nearly a mile, heading down toward the edge of the tree line before they disappeared, covered by the ever-present snow. Following the direction of the tracks, the searchers made their first grim discovery. Beneath a large, ancient cedar tree, they found the remains of a small fire, and next to it, lying side by side in the snow, were the bodies of two of the men, Yuri Krivonishenko and Yuri Doroshenko. They were stripped down to their underwear. Their hands were raw and scraped, and the branches of the cedar tree above them were broken up to a height of 15 feet, suggesting one of them had frantically tried to climb it, perhaps to get a better view of the tent, or of whatever had chased them from it. They had frozen to death, but the scene made no sense. Why had they built a fire, only to die beside it? Why, in their final moments, did they not return to the tent for the clothes that would have saved them? The search continued. 3 more bodies were found between the cedar tree and the tent, at different intervals along the slope. Igor Dyatlov, the leader, Zinday Kolmogorova, Rustem Slobodin. Their positions suggested they had been trying to return to the tent. They were crawling back up the slope, back towards the source of the terror, a final desperate act of courage. They too had died of hypothermia, but Slobodin's skull was fractured. It was the first sign that this was not just a story of freezing to death. It was in these early days of the search, as they recovered the first 5 bodies and the contents of the tent, that they found the cameras. They developed the film, hoping for a clue, an answer. Most of the pictures were what they expected: landscapes, candid shots of the team, the setup of the final camp. But on the roll from one of the cameras, there was a final, inexplicable image. The photograph, numbered frame 34, is a smear of blackness, punctuated by a series of strange orange geometric shapes and orbs of light against the night sky. It is the last picture they ever took. It is the only visual evidence of what might have been happening outside the tent just before the panic began. The discovery of the last photograph deepened the mystery into a chasm of speculation. What were these strange orange lights? Flares? The headlamps of another group? Or something else? Something utterly alien to the hikers' experience? The Soviet authorities, managing the investigation, offered no official explanation. The image became a historical artifact of pure enigma, a Rorschach test onto which 100 theories could be projected. To the families, it was a torment, a ghostly final message from their loved ones that offered no clarity, only more questions. The search for the remaining 4 hikers dragged on for 2 more months. Spring arrived late in the Urals, and as the immense drifts of winter snow finally began to melt, the mountain gave up its last and most terrible secrets. In early May, in a wooded ravine nearly 100 yards from the cedar tree, a Mansi hunter discovered the final bodies buried under 15 feet of compacted snow. Here, in this snowy tomb, lay Nicholas Thibault-Brignoles, Alexander Kolevatov, Ludmila Dubinina, and Semyon Zolotaryov. Their condition shattered any remaining hope of a simple, rational explanation. These 4 were better dressed than the others, and there was evidence that they had taken clothes from their friends who had already perished. A grim but logical act of survival, but their injuries were catastrophic. Thibault-Brignoles' skull had been crushed. Zolotaryov and Dubinina had suffered massive chest fractures, their ribs shattered with a force that one investigator compared to a car crash. The damage was purely internal. Their skin was unbroken. There were no bruises, no cuts, no signs of a physical struggle with an assailant. It was as if they had been squeezed by an immense, invisible force. And then there was the most grotesque detail of all. Ludmila Dubinina, the young woman, was missing her tongue, her eyes, and part of her lip, and the tissue had been removed with a precision it defied explanation. As the bodies were brought back for autopsy, the enigma only intensified. The medical examiner, Dr. Boris Vosresdeny, was baffled. He concluded that the hikers in the ravine had died from their horrific internal injuries, not from hypothermia. He stated explicitly that the force required to cause such damage could not have been inflicted by another human being. He ruled out an animal attack, as there were no tracks and no bite marks. When asked what could have caused these injuries, he had no answer. The final, confounding piece of evidence came from the Geiger counters. When the clothes of the victims were tested for radiation, several items, particularly a sweater belonging to one of the men found in the ravine, showed significant levels of contamination. The source of this radiation was never identified. It was a bizarre science fiction detail in an already impossible story. The Soviet state, a regime built on the principles of order and absolute control, was now faced with a story that defied both. An official inquest was launched, but it was clear from the start that the goal was not to find the truth, but to close the case. They interviewed the Mansi hunters, who spoke of strange fireballs in the sky around the time the hikers disappeared. They spoke of the mountain spirits, of the curse that lay upon Kholat Syakhl. The investigators dismissed these as primitive superstition. They explored the theory of an avalanche, but the physical evidence at the campsite made it impossible. They considered the idea of an attack by escaped prisoners from a nearby gulag, but again, the lack of tracks and the nature of the injuries made this nonsensical. The official conclusion, when it came, was a masterpiece of bureaucratic obfuscation. The file was closed in late May 1959, and the cause of death was attributed to a compelling natural force which the hikers were unable to overcome. The phrase was meaningless, a black box designed to contain an unsolvable problem. The case files were classified, access was restricted, and an official silence descended. For the families, it was a final, cruel blow. Their children were dead, their bodies mutilated in ways that defied comprehension, and their government, the all-powerful state, was telling them it was simply an act of nature, a case closed. But stories like this do not stay buried. The very strangeness of the details, the sliced tent, the missing tongue, the crushed ribs, the radiation, the final cryptic photograph kept the incident alive. It became a legend, a modern piece of folklore whispered among hikers and mountaineers in the Soviet Union. It was a ghost story, a cautionary tale about the dark and unknowable power of the wilderness. The 9 bodies, arranged in their illogical tableau of death, became a mythic image of human fragility in the face of the incomprehensible. They were no longer just students. They were a symbol of a mystery that could not be solved, a wound that could not be healed. Their final desperate diary entry, the simple words about the difficulty of the trail, became a haunting epitaph. They had no idea that the true difficulty was not the slope of the mountain, but the veil of reality that was about to be torn away from them. For decades, the story of the 9 hikers lived in this state of suspended animation, trapped between a classified file and a ghost story. But with the fall of the Soviet Union, the files were partially opened, and a new generation of investigators, armed with modern forensic science and a relentless curiosity, began to pick at the cold threads of the case. The official silence had created a vacuum, and into that void rushed a flood of theories, each attempting to impose a logical narrative on a fundamentally illogical event. The scientific explanations center on the hikers' fateful decision to camp on the open slope of Kholat Syakhl. It was a fatal error, a breach of mountain protocol that may have exposed them to a rare and terrifying natural phenomenon. One leading theory points to katabatic winds, ferociously powerful currents of cold, dense air that can rush down a slope at hurricane speeds, creating a terrifying, roaring sound. More importantly, These winds can also generate infrasound, a low-frequency noise that is below the threshold of human hearing, but can have profound physiological effects. Infrasound can induce feelings of inexplicable dread, nausea, and pure, irrational panic. In this scenario, the hikers are awoken not by a monster, but by an invisible assault on their senses. Their hearts pound, their minds are flooded with a terror they cannot source, and their only instinct is to flee, to get away from the tent, which feels like the epicenter of the torment. This could explain the frantic escape, the sliced canvas, the lack of proper clothing. It is a story of a fatal confluence of a poor campsite and a freak weather event. Other theories point back to the Cold War and the secretive nature of the Soviet state. The orange orbs in the final photograph become the central clue, interpreted as evidence of a secret military test gone horribly wrong. The northern Urals were a known proving ground for the Soviet military. Could the hikers have accidentally strayed into the test site of a new weapon, a concussion bomb, a radiological device? This theory accounts for the horrific, blast-like internal injuries, the traces of radiation on the clothing, and the government's swift and secretive efforts to close the case. In this telling, the compelling natural force was not an act of nature, but an act of man, and the subsequent cover-up was an attempt to hide a catastrophic military blunder. And then there are the older stories, the ones that predate the Soviet Union and its secret weapons. The folklore of the Mansi people, who warned that this was the mountain of the dead. They see the hikers not as victims of infrasound or a missile, but as trespassers who ignored the ancient warnings. Their story is not one of science or conspiracy, but of a sacred law that was broken and a price that was paid. But no single theory, however compelling, can neatly account for all the bizarre details. The katabatic wind theory doesn't fully explain the massive internal trauma. The military test theory doesn't explain why the bodies were scattered over such a large area, or the specific, surgical nature of Lyudmila Dubinina's injuries. The story remains a puzzle box, its pieces refusing to fit together into a coherent whole. And so we are left where we began, in the snow, with the three artifacts that define this tragic epic. We have the human testimony, the final diary entry. From this point on, the trail is difficult. These simple, practical words have become a profound and unintentional prophecy. The hikers believed the difficulty was the 35-degree slope, the fading daylight. They did not know they were standing on the precipice of a different kind of trail, a path that led them off the map of human experience and into a place where all their training, all their courage, would be meaningless. We have the historical object, a camera with its final chilling photograph. Frame 34 is the artifact of the moment when their world broke. It is the tangible evidence of the compelling natural force, the last rational act of a group trying to document the inexplicable thing that had appeared in their sky. The orange orbs hang in that photograph forever, a silent, mocking question mark, the point where a hiking trip became a horror story. And finally, we have the mythic image, the 9 bodies arranged in their impossible tableau of death. They are the final, unreadable text of the Dyatlov Pass Incident. The crushed ribs, the missing tongue, the traces of radiation, these are the details that elevate a tragic accident into a modern myth. They are a permanent monument to the terrifying idea that there are forces in this world, whether natural or man-made, that can shatter the human body and the laws of logic with equal, terrifying ease. The folly of Igor Dyatlov and his friends was not one of inexperience or lack of courage. It was the simple, human folly of believing that the world is a knowable, conquerable place. Their story, preserved in the cold silence of the archive, is a cautionary tale that whispers a single chilling truth. Some mountains do not forgive, and some questions have no answers.